Let's learn about different types of cameras. A lot of people don't realize that cameras have existed long before photography, and that might seem counterintuitive, but what really is a camera? Well, camera comes from the Latin word or words, camera obscura, meaning dark room. Obscura is dark, camera is room. A camera is basically a dark room with a hole on one side or an aperture that lets in the light, and a camera is simply a light-tight space. A room, a box, a chamber, in fact chamber comes from the word camera, into which we distill a small amount of light. If you're under the shade of a tree on a sunny day and you look down at the ground, you'll see little bits of dappled light, and that light falls in little circles. You'll see that the light kind of and generally forms into a shape of a circle. And that's because each one of those images is essentially an image of the sun, and the sun is a circle, and that image of the sun is projected down through little gaps in the leaves and forms that shape. And the proof of this is if you ever go outside on the day of an eclipse and you look down at the same kind of dappled light on the ground, it's not going to be in a circle, it will be in the shape of a crescent because the sun is now partially blocked by the moon, takes on that crescent shape. Well, if you kind of take this idea, this principle of the way that light gets projected through a small opening, you can create a camera by taking a room, blocking all light that comes into a room except a small little opening about maybe the size of a dime or a nickel. And here what you see is a camera obscura room. This is a room in which the outside world is projected in through a small little opening. That image becomes twisted around and becomes upside down and backwards. Although we're looking at a black and white image here, you would actually see a color image. You'd see the trees in I think that's Central Park in the distance would be green, the sky would be blue, you would see cars moving along the street, you would see clouds moving across the sky. This is an image by Abelardo Morel, a Cuban-American photographer who set up a camera obscura room and then a camera inside that room to capture that image. Here is a very simple camera made from a cardboard box with a lens attached to one side. That lens is helping amplify the light and focus that light. And you'll see that the image of the light bulb outside the camera is projected in to the back side of the box inside the camera. And you'll see that the image is upside down. It's also backwards. And the reason that is that the light from the top of the lens, if it can pass through the lens or the aperture, it will continue on a straight line and end up at the downside, the bottom of the back of the box. And the light from the bottom of the bulb will travel on a straight line if it passes through the lens and will reach the top side of the back of the box. And this image is also by Abelardo Morel. Now this phenomenon has been known about for centuries, maybe millennia, and in the Renaissance, artists would use camera obscuras to be able to render a very accurate view of the world. If you were inside a box like this with no light coming in except for the light passing through the very small opening, which we would call an aperture, you would see a pretty accurate and faintly rendered view of the world. It would be upside down, and the artist could trace that image to get a very accurate drawing. But of course, this is very inconvenient to try to bring some huge box around to different scenes or to build one. So later on, there were more portable versions. This is a small box version of a camera obscura. And the way that this worked was that there was a lens on one side of this box. The box kept out the light from the inside. The lens helped amplify and focus the light into the inside of the box, and then there was a mirror inside which would bounce that light up to a piece of ground glass, and that would allow the artist to see that image as a faint projection which they could trace. So faint that you had to be either under the shade or under a dark cloth or the lid of the box to protect that from the ambient light. Now, as photography came to be with light-sensitive materials, cameras became more and more advanced. And one of our first and major types of cameras that we have is a view camera. This camera looks really complicated, and it might look rather old. This looks like an old-timey kind of camera, but in fact artists still use them today. It's really pretty simple though. You have a lens board and a film or viewing board, and those are connected with a bellows. It looks kind of like an accordion, and that helps keep the light out. Here's an X-ray view of a view camera. The lens is to the left, the film or viewing board or film holder is to the right, and here is the accordion bellows which keeps the light out. You'll notice that this is on a track, and by changing the distance between the lens and the film plane, you can control where in your scene is in focus. Here's a diagram kind of explaining this. The light rays enter through the lens, they get transposed at the aperture, and this is why we see the image upside down. Usually this camera is mounted on a tripod with a rail that allows the lens to be moved and to change the focus. And the photographer is at the back of the camera looking at the surface of the ground glass which captures that image. Later on, the film would go into this position in a film holder to receive the light. Now, when you're at the back of one of these cameras, you see a faint image, kind of like a rear projection TV screen, if that is relevant to anyone's frame of reference. And the image is going to be upside down and backwards because it's not been corrected in any way. It's simply transposed directly through the aperture, upside down and backwards to the viewing, to the ground glass. Now, it's a faint image, so to see it, you generally have to be under a dark cloth. Now, there's pros and cons to this camera. You have a very large format film, 4 by 5 inches, 8 by 10 inches, even larger, which gives you very high resolution. Those film planes and lens planes can be tilted and shifted to control perspective and focus. It's a relatively simple mechanical camera and is therefore fairly quiet in its use. And you can also interchange the lenses. Now, there are some cons. It's a very large camera, it's rather unwieldy, it takes a while to set up, so it's kind of a slower process, and you only get 2 sheets of film per holder. Now, you could bring a lot of different holders with you when you go out to photograph, but you only have 2 sheets of film in each holder. The next camera I want to talk about is the Twin Lens Reflex, or TLR. Twin lens reflex, you see, has 2 lenses, hence the name twin lens. Why does it have 2 lenses? Well, the top lens is for viewing the scene and the bottom lens actually takes the photograph. Because of this slight difference in where the lenses are positioned, you're seeing a very slightly different image or different vantage point than the camera is going to take. And we call this a parallax. You have a slightly different view. Now, in order to view the image, there's a mirror located inside this upper portion of the camera which bounces the image up to the viewfinder, very much like that box camera obscura camera. So that allows the viewer to see the image up here. It's a look-down focusing system, and that mirror is where the term reflex comes in. This camera takes roll film, which can have 12 or 24 exposures depending on the exact format of the film, and that image is usually 2¼ inches square and considered a medium format. This is a waist level camera that you look down into from above. It has a focusing knob on the side. This lower position of the camera means that you have a lower vantage point, means that everything else in your scene generally kind of rises up. I think that's generally pretty effective for a composition. Most people hold the camera up high with a standard single lens reflex camera that we'll get to. But with a TLR, you hold it down lower, and that lower vantage point kind of generally creates a more dramatic composition. And also, I feel that this camera is less confrontational to a human subject. You're cradling it down at waist level. You're looking down as opposed to holding a camera up to your face and aiming it and staring through the lens directly at the subject. Now, when you look down into a twin lens reflex, you see this faint image on the ground glass. That image is right side up, which is great, but it's still left, right, backwards. And that can be a little bit tricky when you first learn to compose with this camera, because if you want more of what you think is on the right side of the frame, as you turn right, you lose it. You have to turn left to get more of what you see on the right side of the frame. The pros of this camera: it's still relatively small and portable. It takes roll film, so you get a lot more exposures per roll, per film. It has pretty good resolution at a medium format. The mechanics are still relatively simple, and so it's a quiet camera, and the image is right side up. Now, if there are cons, that parallax view, you're going to see a slightly different image than you actually get. So you have to learn to adjust for that, especially if the subject is close to the camera. The image is still reversed left to right, and that takes a little getting used to. Even when you get used to like which way to turn, what I never got used to was when I went to print the image later, it was backwards from the image that I had sort of burned into my memory. And also the lenses are generally not interchangeable on these kind of cameras. Next up we have the rangefinder. A rangefinder is a smaller camera. It's very portable. It takes 35mm film. This is even smaller than the medium format 120 film with a twin lens. It has one main lens for taking the photograph, but that's not the lens that you see out of. You actually see out of an upper viewfinder, which is above and slightly to one side of your main taking lens. It's a lightweight camera. It's pretty quiet. This is a camera that was preferred by street photographers, someone like Henri Cartier-Bresson or Robert Frank, or later, say, Joel Meyerowitz might have wanted to use this kind of a camera. Now, what gives the rangefinder its name is the focusing system. When you look through the viewfinder, everything looks fairly sharp, actually. Nothing really looks fuzzy or out of focus, but when you're looking at a subject, like you see this camera on a little seamless tabletop setup, it might be a double image of that thing, and that tells you that it's not going to be in focus, that that's not the proper range. So as you change the focus, you'll see the image unify, and that's when you know that you have found the range, hence the name rangefinder, and that that subject will be in focus. It's not super intuitive if you're used to working with a single lens reflex camera. We're used to thinking about simply the image doesn't look sharp, or it looks sharp, and that's what tells us the focus. In this case, you really have to be careful and get that image unified to know whether the scene is in focus or your subject is in focus. Also, like the twin lens reflex camera, you're seeing a very slightly different view of the scene, and again, that's known as parallax. The pros of this camera: compact, lightweight, portable. It has fairly simple mechanics. It's a very quiet camera. When you click the shutter, you barely hear anything. It takes roll film, and it has interchangeable lenses. The cons, well, it's a small format, so it doesn't have as good of resolution as the TLR or the view camera. You do have this parallax view, and it takes a little bit of getting used to the focusing system. The single lens reflex, or SLR, you'll often hear it referred to as DSLR in the digital age, for digital SLR, digital single lens reflex camera. This is a relatively small camera. It has just one lens. There's no separate viewfinder. In order to see out of this lens, and you're seeing out of the same lens that's going to take the picture, this involves some complex mechanics. Now I'm going to tell you the pros and cons right off the bat here. Pros: small and portable, no parallax view. You're going to see exactly what you get. The lenses are interchangeable. But the cons: it's some complicated mechanics to allow all of this to happen, and that means the camera is going to be louder, which I'll explain here. In order for you to see out of the same lens you're going to take the picture with, you have to have a mirror inside this camera, like the TLR, like the old camera obscura, that's going to reflect that image up into a viewfinder and flip that image around. And this viewfinder has what's called a pentaprism, which makes that not only the image will be right side up, but it will also be left-right correct, and that's great. The downside is that same mirror is blocking the light from getting to your film or your digital sensor. And so when you take the photograph, that means that that mirror has to flip up and out of the way and then back down, and that requires some complicated mechanics, and that also means there's going to be more noise. Most of the sound you hear when you shoot with an SLR is what's called mirror slap. It's that mirror going up and down. Let's talk about some compact cameras. These would be smaller than an SLR. This compact digital camera is the Canon G series. Still offers the photographer all the manual controls of like ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, but much smaller, can fit in your pocket. It's kind of built on the rangefinder model with a separate little viewfinder that you look out of, but it might have like an auto-focusing system. One downside: you can't change the lenses. Now, we don't really see these anymore, but this is what would be known as a point-and-shoot camera. Pocket size as well, but offers the photographer no manual controls whatsoever. You basically just point and shoot. You click the button, the camera has internal programming that takes care of everything else as much as it can. You don't really see these anymore because once smartphones came along, they were basically phased out. Very popular these days, however, is a mirrorless camera, or single lens mirrorless. It's not a single lens reflex technically, because without a mirror there is no reflex, but this camera has a single lens. It's interchangeable. The photographer sees out of the same lens that you're going to take the photograph with, but there is no mirror inside. It's simply an active sensor. The same sensor that's going to record the picture sends the image directly either to a rear screen or to a viewfinder. Here's a more advanced version of the mirrorless camera, very popular, is the Sony A7 series. Here is the viewfinder up here. Now when you look into that viewfinder, you're not seeing optically out of the lens with the assistance of a mirror, you're seeing out of the lens with a digital display. So it looks a little bit different, but you are seeing the exact same image that you're going to get, you're going to capture with that lens. These cameras also, because there's no mirror inside, the lens is very close to the sensor, which yields a very sharp image. The lenses are interchangeable and they're usually pretty good. So pros of this camera, it's still fairly small, portable, maybe more the size of an SLR. There's no parallax view, the lenses are interchangeable, generally they're very sharp, and this is also a quiet camera. It doesn't have the mirror that makes all the noise in an SLR. Now the cons, the main con for me is the viewfinder is showing you a digital display, not an optical display. I find that kind of distracting. It looks kind of like a little TV picture inside. And also at this point, these cameras are fairly expensive. This is the last camera I'm going to talk about, and we'll get into anatomy of cameras in the next slideshow.